praxis is his word, for action. Political science exists for the sake of the human good, and the opening sentence of the Politics confirms this. He says, we see, everyone does everything for the sake of some apparent good. All action, all human behavior is aimed at achieving some type of good, is all aimed at action. All political action aims at preservation or change. When we act, we seek to preserve or to change. All political action, you might say, is guided by the idea of better or worse. It implies a standard, or better and worse, and this implies some idea of the good by which we judge. So it follows, at least Aristotle believes so, that the study of politics is not, again, for the sake of knowledge for its own sake, but knowledge that serves the regime. It helps to make it better or prevent it from becoming worse. Its goal is not just to know more, but to know how. And this requires not only theoretic acumen, but political judgment and a kind of practical knowledge that Aristotle discusses at length. This quality of practical judgment and reflection is again somehow unique to the political art or the political skill, Aristotle tells us. It is the ability not only to keep the ship of state afloat, but allows the greatest statesman to guide the ship, to steer it safely to port. That is to say, the kind of knowledge needed by the statesman. And Aristotle's political science, then, is ultimately the supreme science of statecraft, a term that, again, we don't hear much about, statecraft or statesmanship. It's regarded, perhaps by today's political science, as too value-laden, too subjective to speak of statesmanship or statecraft. And this, too, again, it's a word that carries distinctive and strong connotations. Who is a statesman? And what are the attributes of the statesman? I've spoken a little about the attributes that Aristotle believes are central to the megalopsychos, the greatest of the statesmen. This will be quite different, for example, from the qualities we will see beginning on Friday and next week that Machiavelli and later Hobbes or Locke believe are necessary for the great founders or statesmen. Plato and Aristotle give their own visions. The philosopher king, the great-souled man, or megalopsychos. But the statesman, again, is the founder, to the highest degree, is the founder of regimes, laws, and institutions. They provide the constitutional framework within which we later figures operate. So if Aristotle's political science is an education for statesmanship, you might say, what are its methods? What are its distinctive methods? How do we educate a statesman? How do we educate potential statesmen? This is a question, what is it? What are its methods? This is a question asked, you might say, of every mature science. It is possession of a method that distinguishes a mature science from simply a jumble of facts, hearsay, inspired guesses, or a random collection of insights and observations. Without a distinctive method for obtaining and organizing knowledge, we are all just groping in the dark. So what is the distinctive method of Aristotle's politics? To some degree, Aristotle refuses to play the methodologist's game. In a well-known passage from the Ethics, he says that our discussions will be adequate if it achieves clarity within the limits of its subject. If it achieves clarity within the limits of its subject. In other words, he seems to be saying it is wrong to demand methodological purity in a subject like politics, where there is always great variety and unpredictability. It is the mark, he says, of an educated person, presumably a liberally educated person, not to demand more precision than the subject matter allows. But that formulation seems in many ways to be question-begging, because how much precision does the subject allow? How do we know? There will always, he suggests, appear to be something ad hoc about the methods used in the study of politics. We will have to let the method fit the subject rather than demanding the subject matter fit a kind of a priori method. To insist on that kind of methodological purity, he implies, would be to impose a false sense of unity, a false sense of certainty or absoluteness on the study of politics, which is variable and contingent and always subject to flux and change. But even while Aristotle may deny that there is a single method appropriate to the study of politics, he proposes a set of common questions that political scientists have to address. And he lays out these questions at the very beginning of the fourth book of the Politics. He lists 4 such questions. The political scientist, he says, must have a grasp of the best regime given the most favorable circumstances. Second, he tells us the political scientist must consider what kind of regime will be best under less than optimal circumstances. Third, the political scientist must have some knowledge of how to render any regime, no matter how imperfect it may be, more stable and coherent. And finally, the political scientist must know something about the techniques of reform and persuasion, what we might call the area of political rhetoric, by which existing regimes can be brought closer to the best. And taken together, these 4 questions are intended to guide inquiry, to shape or direct inquiry. They are not intended to yield sure or certain results, but to guide and inform statesmen and citizens in the business of decision-making. So bearing in mind that political science is a practical science, a science of judgment, a science aimed at directing action under specific circumstances and situations, it is important, Aristotle finally suggests, the language of political science express the common sense or ordinary language of political actors. There is virtually no jargon in Aristotle's politics. Aristotle's political science stays entirely within the orbit of ordinary speech. Such language does not claim to be scientifically purged of ambiguity, but rather adopts standards of proof appropriate to people in debates, in assemblies, in courts of law, in council rooms, and the like. The language of Aristotelian political science is the language of man, the political animal. You will never hear him speaking in terms of dependent or independent variables. You will never hear him using technical jargon artificially imported into the science of politics or the study of politics from the outside. But what most distinguishes Aristotle is that his language is addressed emphatically to citizens and statesmen, not to other political scientists or philosophers. It has a public orientation. It is publicly directed. It is public-spirited. It is concerned with the common good. Contrast that with today's political science. Today, it seems political scientists are more concerned with advancing the abstract truths of science and claims about creating a methodologically rigorous and pure science of politics, where Aristotle is more concerned with the regime. Modern political science, in many ways, claims to stand above or apart from the regime, to be objective, to be disinterested, as if it were viewing human affairs from a distant planet Aristotle takes his stand from within politics and the regime of which he is a part. Of course, we all know contemporary political scientists are not neutral. They frequently insert their views, values we call them, value judgments we call them. They insert them into their discussions. But these values are regarded by them as purely subjective, their own value judgment, so to speak, and not strictly speaking a part of the science of politics. But we all know, do we not, that most contemporary political scientists tend to be liberals. Their values are liberal values. This raises a question, whether the relation between contemporary political science and liberalism is merely accidental, or whether there is some intrinsic, some necessary connection between them. So one might do well to ponder which political science is really more scientific. Aristotle's, which is explicitly and necessarily evaluative, and that offers advice and exhortation to the statesmen and citizens about how to care for their regime, or contemporary political science that claims to be neutral and nonpartisan, but which smuggles its values and preferences in always through the back door. And on this very partisan note, I conclude. So, on Friday, let me just remind you, Il Principe will study Machiavelli.